Here are 7 of the best 6-person tents, and let's get straight into the first test, which is ease of use. I split this test into 2 different parts, which is the ease of setup and the ease of takedown and pack away. Let's start with the setup. So here's how long each 6-person tent took me to set up, including staking and guying out the tents. I was able to set up every single one of these tents on my own, so these timings are all 1-person timings. The quickest tent to set up is, you might have guessed it, the instant Caddis Rapid 6, and that's because all the poles are pre-attached. All I had to do was to unfold them, pick them up, and extend each pole upwards, then set up the rainfly. It's as simple as that. Next up, we have the Coleman Sundome 6, which has a very simple 3-pole setup. The 2 main poles are to be crisscrossed over each other for the tent body, and the last pole is for the rainfly. Overall, a very simple dome tent setup, which is why it didn't take very long. The NTK Cherokee 6 has the exact same 3-pole setup as the Sundome 6, 2 for the tent body and 1 for the rainfly. But while the Sundome comes with these user-friendly Velcro strips to secure the rainfly, the Cherokee comes with these straps instead, which I had to tie up, and it took so much longer. The next tent is the Eureka Copper Canyon LX6, which has a standard 6-pole cabin tent setup. The 2 fiberglass poles are for the roof of the tent, and the 4 steel leg poles are for the walls of the tent. After that, just secure the rainfly in place. And just take note here that simple cabin tents usually take a little longer to set up than simple dome tents, mainly because you have more poles to deal with. The REI Base Camp 6 has a slightly more complex dome setup with 5 poles instead. The first 2 poles, which are these blue poles, are to crisscross over each other, so the same as the Sundome and the Cherokee. However, there's still another 2 of these black poles to set up, and these are to intersect the 2 blue poles, and this reinforces the main tent body. On top of that, the base camp also has 2 vestibules to be set up, one at the front and another at the back, so it takes a little longer than your simple dome tent without a vestibule. Basically, the more features, the longer the setup will take you. Next up, we have the REI Wonderland 6, which also comes with 5 poles. The first pole runs the entire length of the Wonderland at the top, and the other 4 poles are for the walls of the tent. I think the Wonderland has a very unique cabin tent shape, so the setup was a little more complex than your standard cabin tent. And the North Face Wawona has a 4-pole setup, which is, like the base camp, a slightly more complex dome tent setup. The first 2 poles crisscross over each other to give you the main tent body, and there's a 3rd pole here for the front of the tent. The main reason this Wawona took me the longest is because the rainfly has a lot of fabric and pole clips, which always catch either on the tent fabric or the poles, so it takes me 2 to 3 tries to get it up, compared to 1 try for the rest of the tent. The last pole helps to shape the vestibule at the front, and that's the gist of the setup. Overall, still manageable. Now for the ease of pack away, here's how long each 6-person tent took me to pack away back into the carry bag, starting with the easiest. The Caddis Rapid was again the easiest because all the poles are pre-attached. I didn't have to unsleeve then pack away the poles, I just needed to fold the poles and the tent body up together. The carry bag was also nice and big, and I had no issues at all fitting everything back in. As for the remaining 6 non-instant tents, I think the 2 biggest things that affect how easily each tent packs away is the carry bag, plus the amount of material you have to pack away. The Sundome and Cherokee both have less features and less materials to pack up, plus the carry bag is top-loading and the opening is decently big, so these were the easiest after the Caddis Rapid. The Eureka actually has a very nice top-loading carry bag with both Velcro and zips. The opening is also decently big, but it took slightly longer because cabin tents have more poles to pack away than simple dome tents. The Wawona's top-loading carry bag has a super huge opening, so even though there's quite a lot of material to pack away, more than your simple dome tent, I found it incredibly easy to get everything back in because of this super huge opening. On the other hand, both my REI tents were a little bit more of a struggle because both the carry bags are side-loading. The opening is at the side, so it's a lot smaller. I don't really like this, and it can sometimes be more of a struggle to get everything packed up. And with that, for the ease of use, here's how I rated each of my 6-person tents. For spaciousness, I looked at the peak height, livability, and the base area of each tent. Starting with the first point, here's the peak height of each 6-person tent from the lowest to the highest. The first 4 are dome tents, while the next 3 are more cabin-shaped, which tend to have higher peak heights. For the livability inside the tent, I like to look at the slope of the walls. Basic dome tents, which have only 2 poles crisscrossing each other, have the least livable space because the walls slope inwards the most. On the other hand, the base camp is a more complex dome tent with 4 intersecting poles, and the tent body even has these pole clips and buckles to be attached to the poles. This pulls the tent fabric outwards, giving you much more livable space than basic dome tents. So in my base camp, my head doesn't touch the wall when I sit up at the sides of the tent, while in my basic Sundome, my head grazes the wall and definitely feels tighter. On par with the base camp, we've also got the Wawona, which has a completely vertical front wall because of this extra pole. Here's a side view of the Wawona, and there's extra livable space that you won't get in a basic dome. Regular cabin tents like the Caddis and Eureka have sidewalls that are almost vertical, which gives you a lot more livable space than any dome tent. In fact, for both my Eureka and the Caddis, the lowest height in the tent is about 66 inches and 68 inches respectively. So I could stand up everywhere inside these 2 cabin tents. And the most spacious is easily the Wonderland 6. 2 reasons why. First, for most cabin tents, the leg poles are actually set up a little bit angled, so your sidewalls are not completely vertical. On the other hand, the Wonderland has completely vertical left and right sidewalls. And second, the peak height in the Wonderland runs the entire length of the tent, give or take a few inches. For the base area, I gotta look at not just the inner tent, but also any vestibules that the tent has. For the inner tent, here's my personal calculations of the length, width, and the base area of each tent, excluding any vestibules for now. You might notice that there's quite a humongous 20 square feet difference between the smallest Wawona and the biggest Caddis Rapid. But surprisingly, every single one of these 6-person tents could fit 6 single sleeping pads, and here's a very quick look at what each tent looks like with 6 pads. But after the 6 pads go in, there's hardly any space left over for anything else. As for queen bed sizing though, only my Wonderland was able to fit 2 queen beds, and that's because the base area is a rectangle. The rest have base areas that are square in shape, and while most of them could fit 2 of my almost queen beds, 2 actual queen beds of 80 by 60 would not be able to fit. Moving on to the vestibule area, only 2 of my tents have vestibules. I'll leave it at this for now, but I'll definitely give you more details about this later in this video. For the total area, I just combined the inner tent base areas and the vestibule areas, and here's the final tally from the biggest to the smallest. And with that, here's how I decided to rate all my 6-person tents for spaciousness. For comfort and features, I'm gonna focus on the door quality, storage options, plus any other features. I think having good quality doors is very important, and here are some things that I look at. How many doors are there? How big are the doors? Can I get in without ducking? Can I unzip or zip the doors up one-handed? How long does that take? Do the zippers snag? Now let's start with the analysis. Here's the number of doors that each 6-person tent has from the most to the least. I've also arranged all these tents according to their door quality from the best to the worst. Let's start with the best, the Wonderland 6. There are 2 doors, both these doors are huge, and each door takes up almost the entire wall of the tent. Also, the doors are super tall, so I didn't even have to duck when getting in and out of the tent. Both doors are completely snag-free. I could unzip and zip each door completely one-handed with no fumbling at all, and it takes just 3 seconds. After that, I just tuck the door fabric into one of the pockets next to the door, taking another 4 seconds. One of the best doors I've seen so far. The second best door that I found is the front door of the Wawona 6. It's also super huge, and I didn't have to duck when getting in and out of the tent. It's also completely snag-free. I needed to use only one hand to unzip the entire door, and it takes just 3 seconds. After that, to keep the door open, I had to roll the fabric up neatly and tie it to the top with these 2 toggles, so not quite as user-friendly as the Wonderland's door pockets, because it takes about 15 seconds to do so. Another reason why the Wonderland is still better is because the back door of the Wawona is super small and not as user-friendly. Next up, we have the Base Camp 6. While the 2 doors are super huge, they're not quite as tall, so I had to tilt my head a little bit to get in and out of the tent. And while the unzipping is completely snag-free and one-handed, for the zipping up, I sometimes had to use two hands to pull the zipper past this bend here, so not 100% one-handed. And that's because there aren't any extra stake loops beneath the door, which the Wonderland and the Wawona have. The rest of the tents have only one door each, so that in itself is already a big downgrade. On top of that, the doors on these tents are quite a bit smaller in size. They're not as tall, so I had to duck when going through all of them, and each of them had this rain flap that will sometimes get in the way of the zippers. This was a bit annoying at times, and it definitely slows down the zipping process. Surprisingly, the doors on the Eureka and the Caddis were not that great. I found the door on the Eureka to be super tight the first time I set this tent up, although it did break in after a few days. And I found the door on the Caddis to be really quite snaggy, the snaggiest of all the tents in this video. As for storage options, here's a quick summary of each 6-person tent from the most to the least. As you can see, there's a huge difference between the tent with the most storage options and the tent with the least. I found that the more premium tents have way more storage options. For example, the Base Camp has huge pockets running all around the tent, except for where you have the doors and the vents here. It also has loops everywhere around the tent on every single wall. Budget tents, on the other hand, have much fewer storage options. I mean, my Sundome 6 has only 2 pockets and 1 loop at the top. That's it. I also decided to take a very quick look at any other features that these tents have, and here's a quick rundown. Weirdly enough, somehow all my higher end tents didn't have e-ports, while the less expensive tents had 1 e-port each. And also, only my Wonderland came with a room divider. And now here's how I rated each of my 6-person tents for comfort and features, with the emphasis being on the quality of the doors. For ventilation, I'm gonna look at both hot day ventilation as well as rainy day ventilation. For hot day ventilation, we're gonna take a look at the amount of ceiling mesh each tent has, plus the size of the windows that can be opened, as well as any cross ventilation there might be in the tent. Easily the most ventilated tent is the Wonderland 6. When I take the rain fly off, check out how much mesh there is on this tent. The mesh doesn't just cover only the roof, it extends down the sides of the tent as well, and I think easily more than half the tent is covered in mesh. I also got to enjoy 360 views because of not just these 2 half-door windows, but also the 2 bottom windows. Adding in the cross ventilation of the 2 doors, hot day ventilation in the summer is simply incredible. Next up, we have the Caddis Rapid 6 with pretty big windows on every wall of the tent. There's also a good amount of ceiling mesh, but unlike the Wonderland, the ceiling mesh doesn't extend down the sides of the tent. Plus, it only has 1 door, so there's less cross ventilation. Following closely to the Caddis Rapid, we have our other cabin tent, the Eureka LX6. This tent also has the same ceiling mesh, only 1 door, plus pretty big windows on every wall of the tent. But I calculated the amount of window ventilation in the Eureka to be about 5% less than the Caddis Rapid. Now that we're done with our cabin tents, which tend to have a little bit more hot day ventilation, let's move on to our 4 dome tents. I think the best of the dome tents has got to be the Wawona 6. A good 3/4 of this front wall, anything above here, is made of mesh for tons of ventilation. On top of that, the 4 walls of the tent all have mesh panels that join together at the top, and the extra front wall pole also extends the mesh outwards, giving you almost like the kind of ceiling mesh that you get in cabin tents, which is really nice. And you can open the back window as well for more ventilation. After the Wawona, I think the Sundome and Cherokee are about the same. The Sundome has 2 pretty huge mesh walls, plus 2 windows, while the Cherokee has the same 2 mesh walls, but 1 window and these small mesh panels instead. And finally, we have our Base Camp 6. There's only a rather tiny skylight, 2 not even half-door windows, and 2 tiny mesh panels. For rainy day ventilation, I looked for any vents or windows that could be kept open in the heavy rain, and I think the best tent has got to be surprisingly the Coleman Sundome 6. With the rainfly over the Sundome's 2 mesh walls, these become vents in the heavy rain, and they're both super huge, spanning the entire width of the tent. There's also this small ground vent, so 3 vents altogether. On top of that, I could crack the 2 windows open if the wind isn't too heavy, thanks to the slightly overhanging rainfly pole. The Caddis Rapid 6 has 3 big window vents, but these are smaller than the Sundomes. Also, I could crack the front window open in the light wind. The Wawona 6 has 2 window vents, and it also has 2 of these smaller vents. Notice that the vents are getting smaller and smaller as we move from tent to tent, so that's how I kind of eyeballed and rated each tent for rainy day ventilation. The Base Camp 6 has 2 roof vents and 2 floor vents, and these were the only vents that I could open and shut from the inside of the tent. After that, we've got the Wonderland 6 with just these 2 windows that I could crack open thanks to the awnings on the outside. There's also 2 of these above door vents, but they're so small they didn't even do very much. The Cherokee has only 2 mesh wall vents, while the Eureka has no vents at all, and only the front window could be cracked open slightly. And here's how I rated each 6-person tent for ventilation. For weather protection, I'm gonna look at both rain and wind. For heavy rain, I put each 6-person tent through a pretty brutal 1-hour rain test, and here are the kind of unfortunate results. First up, and hats off to the Wawona 6, I put this tent through not 1, but 3 hours of pouring rain, plus flooding, and this tent still passed with flying colors. The Base Camp 6 went through a 1-hour hose test, which is much heavier than your average rain, and it stayed completely dry as well. However, it's not as great as the Wawona because of the flooring seams, which I found were not taped. They were only inverted. So when I sprayed water directly onto the tent body, which dripped down to the seams, it leaked after an hour. It wouldn't have survived the Wawona's flooding test for sure. The next 3 tents had a little bit of leakage after the 1-hour heavy rain test. For the Wonderland, it was the seams of the divider loops at the bottom. For the Eureka, it was these vertical seams, and for the Caddis Rapid, it was these corner seams. Essentially, I think cabin tents aren't as waterproof because the rainfly is much smaller, so more water runs over the tent body and into the seams. The last 2 more budget-friendly tents started leaking after about 35 to 40 minutes, and that's because the seam taping is definitely lacking. And as for wind protection, I'm gonna be honest, I don't usually camp in strong winds, so I didn't do quite as thorough a wind test, but here's a few things that I learned. First, cabin tents are definitely not great in wind because of their vertical sidewalls. In fact, here's my Eureka blowing over in a light breeze the moment I removed the stakes to take down the tent. On the other hand, I was able to test my Wawona 6 in slightly more moderate winds of about 15, maybe 20 miles per hour, and it held up like a champ. Also, the more guidelines your tent has, the better. So when I was testing my Wawona, it really helped that I had almost the entire tent guide out. Here's basically a quick summary of what I just explained, and I listed what I think is the best tent in the heavy wind to the not so good tents. There's actually another point I need to mention, which is pole quality, and I'll go through that in just a few minutes. For now, here's how I rated each 6-person tent for weather protection. For quality, I looked at the flooring, the tent body, the poles, zippers, mesh, seam quality, and seam taping. Let's start with the flooring, and here's a quick summary of the flooring material in each tent, starting from the best. Generally, I found that higher-end camping tents tend to have much thicker floorings, at least of 150 denier polyester. I'm honestly a little surprised that Eureka chose to have only a 75D polyester flooring, which is half as thick. On the other hand, more budget tents like Coleman and NTK are usually made of less expensive polyethylene. Moving on to the material of the rest of the tent, here's another quick summary for you. Honestly, I'm pretty surprised at the thickness of the flooring and the tent body in the Caddis Rapid 6. It's actually a lot thicker than even the more expensive tents on this list. Apart from the Caddis Rapid, the tent body and rainfly of better quality tents tend to be made of at least 75D polyester, while budget tents are made of 68D polyester. Coleman is a little better because some of their rainflies are made of 75D polyester, while NTK is 68D all around. As for the quality of the poles, here's a quick rundown for you. Easily the best quality poles are the Wawona's, which is the ACMX, top of the line type of aluminum poles. These poles not only snap together super easily, but they are also a lot stronger than regular aluminum poles. In the weeks that I spent testing my Wawona 6, through crazy rains and some winds, none of my poles bent at all. Next up, we have the two REI tents with just regular aluminum poles, which are not as strong. So for my Wonderland 6, I found that a few of my poles bent after some use. And here's how pole quality affects the wind resistance of each tent. Basically, DACMX will always trump regular aluminum. A friend of mine used his Wawona 6 through 50-mile-per-hour wind, and here's the state of the poles after. Honestly, still not too bad, and not even as bent as my Wonderland poles, which didn't even go through a strong wind test. As for the quality of the zippers, here's what you'll find in each 6-person tent. Only my REI tents came with YKK zippers, but somehow only the doors have YKK zippers. The windows have no brand zippers. The Wawona and Eureka have SBS zippers, so a grade lower than YKK, but still pretty good quality. And the plus side is that both the doors and the windows are SBS. I'm a little surprised that the Caddis Rapid 6 skimped on the zippers when the rest of the tent is pretty high quality. No brand zippers are usually what I find on more budget tents instead. As for the quality of the mesh that you'll find in each tent, here are the details. Again, you can see quite a big difference between the more premium tents and the budget tents. I wrote down fine for these 5 tents because none of these brands specifically say that their mesh is no-seam mesh, although it feels like it to me, and the holes look really fine as well. The mesh on my budget tents have much bigger holes. For the seam quality in each tent, I found that the more premium tents tend to not have many loose threads. They're all nicely reinforced, especially at the corners as well as the rest of the flooring, and the stitching is nice and consistent. On the other hand, the more budget-friendly tents tend to have more loose threads, slightly less consistent stitching, and some holes in the seams can be a little larger than others. As for seam taping, the pricier tents tend to have much better seam taping, while budget tents are usually really lacking in this department, and you probably saw that in the rain test. So here's how I rated all the tents based on quality. For portability, I'm just going to quickly flash the weight and packed size of each tent across the screen right here, and here's how I rated each 6-person tent for portability. And finally, here are the overall results. I spent over $2,000 buying these 7 6-person tents, and if you're wondering whether I return these tents after testing them, no, I absolutely do not. I also spent at least 2 to 3 weeks testing each tent, so if this video has been helpful, please help me hit that like button. Thank you, and I really appreciate it. Based on this weightage, I tried to make these scores as equal as possible across all the different tests, and here's the overall score for each 6-person tent. But before you buy any of these, let me talk about my recommendations, and I've got quite a few of them to help you pick the best one for yourself. Starting with my top pick, that's easily the North Face Wawona 6. It not only has the best overall score, but it's also my best all-rounded tent. The Wawona is only yellow in just one test. On the other hand, all of my other tents have yellers in at least 2, some 3, some 4, and some even 5 different tests. This tent also topped all the other tents in not just quality, but also for rain and wind protection. Speaking of which, there are 3 reasons why the Wawona is the best for rain pick. First, I put my Wawona through the heaviest rain test of all my other tents. After 3 hours of this non-stop super heavy rain, the Wawona was completely dry. I did notice that the back wall was slightly damp when I touched it after the 3rd day of rain, but still, easily the best of all the other tents. Second, you don't have to seal any of the seams. Every single seam is perfectly taped. I was lucky enough to test this as well. Because it rained so heavily, my entire yard was flooded, and the bottom of my Wawona, especially this corner here, was sitting in 2 inches of water. After the rain stopped, I checked the seams at this corner, and there wasn't any leaking into the tent. Third, this Wawona has the most awesome vestibule, which is super useful for storing wet gear. You might have noticed in our second test that the base area of the Wawona's vestibule is slightly smaller than the base camp. But here's what I haven't mentioned. Livability in the Wawona's vestibule is actually much better. Here's why. The tallest height inside the Wawona's single vestibule is about 74 inches, while the shortest height at the other end is still a whopping 65 inches. So I could stand upright throughout the entire vestibule. In fact, I could fit 2 camping chairs and still have plenty of leftover space for a big camping table. This is definitely not the case with my base camp. While the front vestibule is pretty big and I could fit 2 chairs, the back vestibule couldn't even fit 1 camping chair. So for livability, inside the vestibule, the Wawona wins hands down. The Wawona 6 is also one of the best family camping tents that I have for summer. It has quite a bit of mesh, plus a whopping 4 doors, 2 in the vestibule and 2 in the inner tent for a ton of cross ventilation. Honestly, rain or shine, for camping in the summer, the Wawona is probably your best bet. Now, the Wawona is also my best value for money pick because on a full price basis, this Wawona isn't even the most expensive. At their full prices, the Base Camp and Wonderland are actually more expensive. After the Wawona, my runner-up pick has got to be the Base Camp. It has the second best score, and it performed almost as well or just as well as the Wawona for all these 7 different categories. There are 3 main reasons why I'd buy the Base Camp instead of the Wawona. First, if the Wawona is out of stock, I'd get the Base Camp. Second, if REI is running one of their sales, and if the Base Camp is quite a bit less expensive, I might go for that instead. And third, I'd go with the Base Camp over the Wawona if I'm planning to camp in the shoulder season, which brings me to my next recommendation. While the Wawona is more of a 3-season tent for camping mainly in summer, the Base Camp is more of a 3+ season tent, and I wouldn't exactly recommend it for hot summers. There isn't a lot of mesh on this Base Camp, the 4 vents in the tent aren't very big, and especially with the full rainfly on, I found that it got a little bit hot and stuffy on hot summer days. But this makes it the best choice for shoulder season camping. If you want to use it for summer though, I recommend leaving the 2 doors or the 2 windows open for some cross ventilation. It's still kind of bearable. Moving on to my choice for the best cabin tent, we've got the Wonderland 6. There are 3 different cabin tents in this video, and the Wonderland scored the highest of them all. Why? Well, first, it has a better rain protection because of its longer rainfly, and it survived the longest of all 3 cabin tents and also leaked the least. Second, it has one of the best quality doors that I've ever seen in a family camping tent. Third, the left and right sidewalls are more vertical than regular cabin tents. Fourth, as a single person, the setup is actually more intuitive and easier than regular cabin tents. Fifth, and now we're kind of moving on to the next point, the Wonderland is actually much better for hot weather compared to any other tent in this video, and I went through all of the points in the hot day ventilation test, timestamp on the screen here. After the Wonderland, my runner-up cabin tent is both the Caddis Rapid and the Eureka. Both tents got exactly the same overall score, and here's how to decide which one is better for you. If you're looking for a 6-person tent that's super easy to set up, the best pick for you has got to be the Caddis Rapid. It's the only instant tent in this video, and the only tent that sets up and packs away in less than 10 minutes. On the other hand, the Eureka takes 50% longer to set up and 60% longer to pack away. This is because of the instant mechanism of the Caddis Rapid, which I found to be very high quality. But of course, instant tents tend to be much longer, and it's about 70% longer than the Eureka. If you prefer a more spacious tent, the Eureka is easily the better pick for you. It's the only tent that has a peak height of a full 7 feet, and I couldn't even reach the very top. When I was standing on tiptoes, I can only reach the lantern loop here. I could even stand up at the corners of this tent and walk around everywhere. If you're looking for a 6-person tent on a budget, well, I think the Sundome easily beats the Cherokee in almost every test. Or you can just click on both links that I left in the description below and get the less expensive one, whichever it is. That works too. Please help me smash that like button if this was useful. Thank you for watching this, and I'll see you in the next one.